She paid a man's rent with her life savings. She never asked for anything in return, just wanted him to have a home. Julia Bennett was a cleaner in a small North Carolina town, scrubbing floors to survive. One day, the Navy anchored her future, and everything changed. Why did the Navy come? How could her selfless act lead to this? What would you sacrifice to give someone a home? Let's find out. Welcome to True Quiet Stories. Let's uncover what happened in this story. If you love these stories, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing. In a small North Carolina town, the air smells of salt and pine. Julia Bennett lived there. She was 36 years old. She worked as a cleaner, running Bennett's Cleaning, a small business that kept her on her feet all day. Julia's shifts were grueling. She scrubbed floors, dusted shelves, and polished windows, her hands raw from years of hard work. She smiled for clients even when her knees ached, even when the bills piled up, even when the weight of keeping her business afloat felt too heavy to bear. Her curly brown hair was always tied back with a faded scarf, her overalls stained with bleach, her eyes tired but bright, a brightness that came from a heart that had known struggle, that had known loss, that had known love, a heart that gave even when it had little to give, even when the world didn't give back, even when the coastal winds seemed to take more than they offered. Julia lived alone in a small apartment above a laundromat, a cramped space with peeling paint, a creaky bed, and a window that overlooked the harbor, the salty breeze, a constant reminder of the things she couldn't fix, of the things she couldn't afford, of the things she couldn't change. Her brother, who'd helped her start her cleaning business, had passed away 3 years ago, a boating accident during a storm, leaving Julia to fend for herself, to keep her business running alone, to hold on to the dream they'd shared, even in the silence, even in the waves, even in the years that had passed since he was gone. Julia kept going. She worked hard. But she had a kind heart. She gave kindness. It was all she could afford. Julia's life in Harborview, North Carolina, was a daily battle against the odds and the past. The town had seen better days. Its harbor, lined with rusty boats, its shops struggling to stay open, its people worn by years of hard work, years of dreams deferred, years of a life that seemed to take more than it gave. Harborview was a small community, just over 5,000 people, a place where everyone knew everyone, where Bennett's Cleaning had been a fixture for years, a service that locals relied on to clean their homes, share stories, and find a moment of connection. A business that Julia's father had inspired, that Julia had built with her brother, that Julia fought to keep alive, even when the odds were against her, even when the payments were late, even when the world seemed to forget her. Work to forget her family, to forget her. She grew up in Harborview, in a small house on Tide Street, where her parents had raised her with love, with resilience, with the belief that hard work was the greatest gift you could give, that kindness was the greatest thing you could share. That hope was the greatest thing you could hold, even when the world was harsh, even when the nights were long, even when the struggles were heavy. Her father, Thomas, had been a dock worker, his hands rough as he loaded crates, his voice warm as he told tales of the sea, his laughter a bright spot in their small home, a laughter that Julia still heard, even now, years after he was gone. Years after the pneumonia took him, years after her cleaning business became her burden, her legacy, her life. Her mother, Eliza, had been a seamstress, her smile a comfort to every neighbor, her hands quick as she mended nets, her faith a steady anchor for their family, her prayers a nightly ritual that Julia still whispered, even now, years after she was gone, years after the stroke took her, years after the cleaning business became her responsibility, her memory, her love. They didn't have much money, their meals simple but hearty, crab stew on Sundays, cornbread on weekdays, a rare treat of pie when the budget allowed. But they had each other, and that made their small house a haven, a place where Julia always felt safe, always felt loved, always felt whole. Those memories were all Julia had left after her brother died. A sudden loss that came on a stormy August night, his laughter silenced, his warmth gone, a void she couldn't fill. He'd been her best friend, her partner in building Bennett's Cleaning, her anchor through every hardship, and his death in that boating accident shattered the life they'd built, leaving Julia with nothing but the apartment, the business, the silence that filled her days, her nights, her heart. She'd been 33 then, her hands still steady, her dreams still alive, but her world forever changed, her heart heavy with grief, with debt, with a life that seemed to demand more than she could give, more than she could bear, more than she could hold. She threw herself into her work, cleaning from dawn to dusk, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, her back aching from hauling supplies, her heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of responsibility, with the weight of an apartment that was always behind on rent. An apartment that hadn't felt like a home since her brother was there. An apartment that reminded her of everything she'd lost, everything she couldn't afford, everything she couldn't fix, even in the silence, even in the waves, even in the years that had kept her apart. But Julia had a kind heart, a heart that still beat with the lessons her parents taught her, with the love she'd shared with her brother, with the hope she held for a better day, a hope that lived on in the small acts of kindness she offered, even now, even here, even in the shadows where no one saw her, where no one cared, where no one knew. She worked with care, taking pride in the homes she cleaned, making sure every surface was spotless, every client was cared for, every smile was genuine, a quiet gift to the people who filled her days, even if they never noticed, even if they never thanked her, even if they never saw the effort she put in, the love she poured into every task, the heart she gave to every job. One humid afternoon in late May, as Julia was finishing a cleaning job at a small rental office on Harborview's Main Street, she overheard a heated conversation through the thin walls. The air was thick with the scent of salt and pine, the kind of sticky heat that clung to her skin as she scrubbed the last of the windows. She adjusted her faded scarf, her breath heavy from the day's labor, her hands raw from the cleaning chemicals, a labor that had yielded just enough to cover her own overdue rent, a labor that reminded her of the dwindling jobs, a labor that she couldn't escape, even in the silence, even in the waves, even in the moments that passed her by. She paused, her rag still in hand, and heard a man's voice, trembling with worry, pleading with the landlord not to evict him, his words broken by the weight of desperation, a desperation Julia understood, a desperation she felt, a desperation she couldn't ignore. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, didn't know the weight he carried, but she knew the sound of someone who'd lost everything, the sound of someone who needed a roof, who needed kindness, who needed hope, even if he didn't ask for it, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Julia set down her cleaning supplies, her steps cautious as she approached the office door, her heart pounding as she listened, as she decided, as she acted, even if she didn't know who he was, even if she didn't know why, even if she didn't know what would come of it. The man's name was Richard Moore, though Julia didn't know that at the time, didn't know the story behind those trembling words, didn't know the weight he carried, the weight of a war that had taken everything, the weight of a life that had left him with nothing, the weight of a silence that had become his only companion, his only comfort, his only truth. Richard was 72 years old, a veteran of the Second World War, a man who'd served as a seaman in the U.S. Navy, who'd manned a destroyer in the Pacific in 1944, who'd seen things he couldn't unsee, who'd done things he couldn't undo, who'd lost things he couldn't reclaim. He'd been a hero once, a man who'd saved his crew during a kamikaze attack, pulling wounded sailors from a burning deck under fire, his own body scarred by shrapnel, his own heart scarred by the screams of the men he couldn't save, by the faces of the friends he'd lost, by the guilt that had followed him home, that had followed him through the years, that had followed him to the rental office where he now stood, where he now pleaded, where he now survived, on the edges of a town that had forgotten him, on the edges of a world that had moved on without him, on the edges of a life that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, the dog tag around his neck, the memories in his mind, the silence in his heart. Richard had lost everything. After the war, his family, his home, his health, his very sense of self. The war a thief that had taken more than he could ever hope to reclaim. He'd come home to Harborview in 1946, a different man than the one who'd left, his eyes harder, his smile gone, his heart heavier with the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the things he couldn't undo. His wife, Margaret, had tried to help, her gentle hands a comfort, her soft voice a lifeline, her love a beacon in the darkness that had consumed him, that had changed him, that had broken him in ways she couldn't fix, in ways he couldn't share, in ways they couldn't survive. But the nightmares were too much, the flashbacks too real, the guilt too heavy, the trauma too strong, a force that pulled him under, that pulled him away, that pulled him apart, until Margaret couldn't hold on any more, until she passed away. From cancer in 1960, leaving Richard alone with their daughter, Lily, a daughter who grew up and moved to Raleigh, seeking a life far from the shadow of a father who couldn't find his way back, who couldn't find his peace, who couldn't find his home. Richard didn't blame her, didn't fight her, didn't beg her to stay. Knowing she was right, knowing he was broken, knowing he couldn't be the father Lily deserved, the man he'd once been, the man he'd never be again. Richard had been living in a small rental apartment in Harborview for years, a cramped unit with a leaky roof, a flickering light, and a bed that creaked with every move. A place where he kept his few possessions, a place where he kept his memories, a place where he kept his silence, a silence that had become his home, his truth, his everything. Inside his room was a faded photo of Margaret and Lily, taken on Lily's 10th birthday, their smiles bright against a sunny park backdrop, a moment of joy frozen in time, a moment Richard held on to, a moment that broke his heart, that kept him alive, that kept him hoping, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't know how, even if he didn't know what for. There was also a letter Margaret wrote him during the war. The paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still legible, words of love and hope that had kept him going through the darkest nights, words he read when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear. And there was his Navy Cross, a medal he'd been awarded for his bravery in the Pacific, a medal he'd buried in a box, a medal he couldn't look at, a medal that felt like a mockery of the pain he carried, of the lives he couldn't save, of the man he'd once been, a man he'd lost, a man he'd never be again. Julia didn't hesitate that afternoon, didn't question, didn't let Richard face the eviction alone, even though she barely knew him, even though her own savings were all she had left, even though her own rent was overdue, a risk she understood, a risk she felt, a risk she couldn't ignore. She walked into the office, her hands trembling as she pulled out every dollar she'd saved, money she'd set aside for her own future, money that was her last safety net, money that held her dreams, her hopes, her survival, even in the silence, even in the waves, even in the years that had kept her apart. She paid Richard's rent, her voice steady as she spoke to the landlord, her heart heavy as she handed over the cash, her eyes soft as she glanced at the man she'd helped, even if she didn't know his story, even if she didn't know his pain, even if she didn't know what would come of it. Richard stood there, his hands trembling as he watched, his eyes glistening with gratitude, his heart a little lighter, his fear a little less, his loneliness a little softer, knowing someone cared, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. For weeks, Julia checked on Richard, a small act of kindness that became a ritual, a quiet promise between two souls who'd barely spoken, who'd never needed to, who understood each other in the way only the struggling can, in the way only those who've known loss can, in the way only those who've been forgotten can. Each day Richard would stay in his small apartment, his steps slow, his body less burdened, knowing he had a roof over his head, his hands clutching the faded photo of his family, A photo that held the warmth of Julia's kindness, a warmth that held the memory of his past, a warmth that held the hope of a better day, even in the silence, even in the waves, even in the years that had kept him apart. Julia never asked for anything in return, never told anyone, never let Richard feel small for needing help, for needing a home, for needing kindness, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it, even if he didn't know her story, even if he didn't know her pain, even if he didn't know the weight she carried, the sacrifice she'd made, the life she lived in, the shadows, in the harbor, in the silence that had become her home. Richard would sit in his room, his hand steady as he held the photo, his eyes glistening with gratitude, his heart a little lighter, his fear a little less, his loneliness a little softer, knowing someone cared, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Julia's act of kindness went unnoticed by most, a silent gesture in a world that rarely stopped to see the quiet heroes, the ones who gave without asking for anything in return, the ones who loved without expecting love back, the ones who kept going even when the world didn't care, even when the world didn't see, even when the world didn't know. But one person did notice, a person who saw more than most, a person whose own life had been touched by the kind of quiet heroism Julia embodied, a person who knew the weight of a past unspoken, the power of a kindness unseen, the value of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return. His name was Ensign Daniel Hayes, a neighbor who lived across the street, a 29-year-old officer in the U.S. Navy stationed at Naval Station Mayport, a man who'd served in the Persian Gulf, who'd known sailors like Richard, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Richard carried, a silence Daniel recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. Daniel overheard the story of Julia and Richard one evening, his hands pausing as he cleaned his boat on the dock, his ears catching the quiet conversation at the rental office nearby, the way the landlord mentioned Julia's sacrifice, the way he spoke of the man she'd helped, the way the moment held a weight Daniel couldn't ignore, a weight that spoke of kindness, of love, of a hero forgotten, even in the silence, even in the waves, even in the years that had kept him apart. He approached Julia the next day, his voice steady as he asked about the man, about the rent, about the kindness she'd given, about the love she'd shared, even if she'd barely known him, even if she'd given everything, even if she'd never expected anything in return, even in the silence, even in the harbor, even in the years that had kept her apart. Julia told him everything, her voice trembling as she spoke, her words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the harbor and the sea, a bridge that brought Richard's story to life, that brought Julia's kindness to light, that brought a hero back, finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the waves that had kept him apart. Daniel didn't stop there, couldn't stop there, wouldn't stop there, knowing Richard's story deserved more, knowing Julia's kindness deserved more, knowing a hero deserved more, even in the silence, even in the harbor, even in the years that had kept him apart. He drove back to Naval Station Mayport that evening, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd learned, with the weight of what he knew he had to do, with the weight of a story that deserved to be told, a story that deserved to be heard, a story that deserved to be honored, even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without them. He called his commanding officer, Captain Laura Evans, a woman who'd served in World War II, who'd known sailors like Richard, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Richard carried, a silence Laura recognized, a silence she understood, a silence she couldn't ignore. Daniel told her everything, his voice steady as he spoke, his words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the harbor and the sea, a bridge that brought Richard's story to life, that brought Julia's kindness to light, that brought a hero back. Finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the waves that had kept him apart. On a sunny Thursday morning, the sound of a ship's horn filled the air off Harborview's docks, a deep bellow that echoed over the waves, that stopped Julia in her tracks, that made her heart pound with fear and curiosity. A sound that spoke of something big, something unexpected. A sound that would change everything, forever, for Julia, for Richard, for the town of Harborview, for the world that would hear their story, that would see their love, that would remember their kindness, their heroism, their humanity, in a way that would last, in a way that would matter, in a way that would echo, louder than words, louder than silence, louder than the waves that had kept them apart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Quiet Stories for more untold tales of valor. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.